On a winter evening in Paris, in the year when the salons glowed brightest, a woman entered a room hung with crystal chandeliers. The air was heavy with perfume, and the soft clatter of glasses was broken by a hush that followed her like a shadow. She wore a dress the color of midnight, stitched by the daring hands of Elsa Schiaparelli, and her gaze swept the gathering as if it were her stage. Some whispered her name with admiration, others with unease, yet all eyes bent toward her. Daisy Fellows had arrived. Greetings, kind listener, wherever you may be. Perhaps you rest in the stillness of night or sit beside the soft hum of morning. I invite you to share in the comments when and where you hear these words, so that across the world our voices form a single circle of memory. And if you wish this circle to grow, I gently remind you to touch the subscribe button, so that this weaving of stories may continue for many nights to come. She was born in 1890 in Paris, into a fortune spun not from silk nor jewels, but from the humble thread of industry, the singer-sewing machine empire. Her father, Prince Pierre de Broglie, lent a noble title, while her mother, Isabelle Blanche Singer, bore the inheritance of staggering wealth. Thus, from the first breath of Daisy Fellows, the two rivers of privilege, aristocracy and commerce, flowed into her cradle. And yet, as the old tales remind us, rivers that join so swiftly often carve a restless current, pulling the child into waters both glittering and perilous. The house in which she grew was vast and silent, its corridors lined with tapestries and mirrors that seemed to multiply her solitude. The air carried the faint scent of wax polished into endless marble floors. Servants moved like shadows, polite, efficient, and distant, their footsteps always withdrawing down the echoing halls. One imagines the young Daisy, small shoes tapping on stone, pausing to glance at portraits of ancestors whose gazes did not soften, whose faces seemed carved in duty. Was she already sharpening her wit then, rehearsing in silence the barbs that would one day make society tremble? Or was she, like many children of wealth, simply lonely, half hidden behind the weight of her lineage? Her mother, heiress of the singer fortune, was fragile of spirit. Some say she was plagued by melancholy, a woman trapped between the world of invention and the rigid rules of French nobility. She died young, when Daisy was still a child, leaving behind a wound that would never close. A motherless daughter among strangers, Daisy grew into herself like a wild rose in an abandoned garden, beautiful yet edged with thorns. The absence of tenderness perhaps shaped the precision of her cruelty, for the world rarely forgives the child who grows without softness. In those early years, wealth ensured that Daisy never lacked for silks, toys, or jewels, but affection cannot be purchased, and thus her world was both abundant and barren. She was educated in convent schools where silence was a form of prayer and obedience was a garment stitched too tightly. She learned languages, history, the manners of courts, yet also the art of concealing longing behind an impassive face. Perhaps she discovered, while tracing letters on a page, that words held power equal to gold, that wit could slice through loneliness, that a remark well placed could become a weapon and a shield. The salons of her girlhood shimmered with candlelight and spoke of duty. She was expected to be obedient, graceful, a daughter to be married well. Suitors with ancient names and polished shoes would have looked upon her with interest, seeing not a child, but an alliance of fortunes. Yet even then, it seems, Daisy carried a defiance beneath her silks. Her gaze was sharp, her voice unflinching. She was not content to be merely ornament, nor to let her destiny be dictated without protest. What child of immense wealth is free of rebellion? What heart that grows in a gilded cage does not dream of the sky? In her adolescence, she witnessed the dawn of a new century. Paris itself was changing, the air humming with invention, art, and whispers of decadence. Automobiles rattled along cobbled streets. The cafes of Montmartre brimmed with poets and painters who scoffed at tradition. The world outside her family's salons beckoned like a forbidden melody, filled with dangers but also with freedom. Daisy would step into that world with deliberate force, yet the seeds of her later scandals were planted in this soil of transition, where wealth could not protect against curiosity. And still, behind the promise of adventure, there lingered the silence of her childhood home. Some have said that Daisy's cruelty, her sharp remarks and unkind wit, were born of this silence, that her barbs were a way of filling the echoing emptiness left by her mother's absence. Others suggest she was simply a mirror of her time, a woman shaped by a society that valued beauty and wealth above tenderness. Which is nearer to truth, no one can say. Yet as she stood at the threshold of adulthood, Daisy Fellows was already preparing to turn her inheritance of loneliness into a weapon of survival. The house itself seemed to know her secret. The chandeliers glittered coldly above dinners where conversation was polite but hollow. Servants whispered in corners, careful not to disturb the young heiress, whose presence carried both privilege and melancholy. At night, the shutters closed against the city's noise, and the rooms grew still, as though awaiting her footsteps. Did she pace those halls, imagining the salons of the future, imagining a world where she would not merely enter as guest, but reign as queen? One imagines a candle flickering in her room, casting shadows across gilt-framed mirrors. Her eyes, wide and restless, reflecting a future not yet written. Outside, the distant bells of Paris rang, tolling the hours of a city in motion. Inside, a young girl sat surrounded by the silence of wealth, the burden of expectation pressing heavy on her shoulders. Perhaps in that silence, Daisy swore to herself that she would never be ignored, that the world would one day whisper her name as it had whispered her mother's absence. And so the cradle of privilege carried her forward, a vessel filled with wealth, wit, and unfulfilled longing. The world was waiting, though it did not yet know it. Daisy Fellows, child of fortune, daughter of absence, was ready to step into the great ballroom of history. The candle burns low, its flame bending in the draught of a vast and lonely room. The shadows stretch across the marble floor, reaching toward the closed door where silence waits. The shadows that stretched across the marble floor seemed to move as if guided by unseen footsteps. And into that hush, the sound of polished shoes resounded, walking away, leaving the child alone among portraits and gilded chairs. That sound, echoing down the long corridors of her youth, never left her. For Daisy Fellows, the memory of departure, of absence dressed in formality, was a companion more constant than affection. It followed her into every salon, every love, every cruel remark that spilled from her lips in later years, and perhaps it was that sound which hardened her resolve to leave before being left, to strike before another could wound her. In the quiet wealth of her childhood, ritual was a language more deeply ingrained than conversation. The day began with curtains drawn wide to let pale light spill across damask walls. Nurses and governesses spoke in lowered tones, teaching lessons of grammar and piety, pressing upon the young girl the strict disciplines of aristocratic life. There was little laughter, for laughter echoed strangely in such rooms, revealing too easily the absence of joy. Silence was the truer music, punctuated by the rhythmic steps of servants whose duty was to glide in, invisible, and then vanish again. Books filled her days, volumes bound in leather, histories of France, tales of saints and kings, but it was the novels tucked away by her governesses that perhaps stirred something restless in her. Stories of heroines who defied convention, of worlds where wit and daring were stronger than titles, seeped into her imagination. She read them secretly, her fingers tracing the words in lamplight, her eyes widening at the thought that rebellion could be disguised as elegance, that a woman might both scandalize and enthrall. Was this the birth of her sharp tongue, her appetite for wit that cut as cleanly as any blade? The convent years added another layer to her spirit. Cloistered in echoing halls where the rustle of habits marked each movement of the sisters, Daisy learned discipline but also resistance. The prayers recited in unison carried no warmth for her. The silence of contemplation mirrored too closely the silence she already knew. Yet in that rigid world she sharpened her eyes, noticing everything, learning the small hypocrisies that made authority human. The nuns, so austere, so resolute in their chastity, were not free of vanity or preference. Daisy watched, storing away every detail, every contradiction. Later in life, when she struck her companions with a remark both true and merciless, perhaps it was these years that trained her gaze to pierce through surface and into the frailty hidden beneath. Her adolescence was marked by this strange combination of wealth without intimacy. Suitors were whispered of, alliances considered, but Daisy was not easily charmed. The young men of her world carried ancient names, but their conversation was predictable, their ambitions tethered to tradition. She, meanwhile, carried the twin inheritance of wealth and absence, which sharpened her desire for something else, though she could not yet name it. Was it freedom? Was it power? Or simply the assurance that she would never again be the one left behind? Even as she entered drawing rooms and salons as a girl nearly grown, observers noticed her poise, her directness. She was not content to smile politely or blush at compliments. Her wit already shimmered, dry and precise, unsettling to those who expected demure obedience. At dinners where conversation revolved around lineage and politics, Daisy offered observations that unsettled older guests, drawing gasps as much as laughter. And though some scolded her lack of restraint, others began to admire her daring. She was not yet the queen of high society, but the crown of words had already been placed upon her brow. The Paris of her youth was awakening into modernity. The streets outside her guarded home vibrated with invention. Automobiles jostled with carriages, telephones carried voices through wires, and artists in Montmartre painted the world in colors few had dared imagine. Daisy, though bound by the codes of her class, could not remain untouched by this current. She breathed it in, the scent of change, and perhaps it mingled with the perfume she would later wear so boldly. The old aristocracy was clinging to its rituals, but Daisy seemed already prepared to walk in both worlds, the old and the new, never fully belonging to either. It is said that childhood is a rehearsal for the roles we play as adults. If so, Daisy's role was already set. The observer who transforms absence into authority, who wields words as both armor and sword, who dazzles not by obedience but by defiance, cloaked in elegance. Yet one wonders as she sat at her desk beneath the watchful eye of a governess. Did she know she was different? Did she sense that the world would not forget her name, not for her kindness, but for her cruelty? Not for her silence, but for her voice? The polished shoes of her childhood still echoed in her memory, marking every departure, every reminder that to be abandoned was to be powerless. And so she grew determined never to feel powerless again. When she entered the salons of Paris as a young woman, the echo of those shoes would follow her, transformed into the tapping of her heels across marble floors, announcing her arrival, warning the world that Daisy Fellows would never be overlooked. In the great ballroom of memory the young heiress stands, her eyes reflecting chandeliers, her expression unreadable. Around her, conversations murmur, laughter flickers, but she is still, poised, waiting. The sound of polished shoes grows distant, yet the silence they leave behind is filled now with something new, her own resolve, fierce and unyielding. And at the edge of that ballroom, half hidden behind a curtain, a smile begins, unfinished, like a secret not yet spoken, a promise that her presence will never again be ignored. The smile that lingered unfinished across her lips was like a curtain half drawn, revealing only the outline of what was to come. In the crowded ballroom, beneath chandeliers that spilled shards of light across silk gowns and lacquered shoes, Daisy Fellows carried herself with an air both enigmatic and disquieting. Conversations faltered as she passed, laughter softened, and the polished masks of society seemed for a moment less secure. That smile, not quite kindness and not quite disdain, suggested a knowledge others lacked, and with it came the first whispers of her ascendancy. Her entry into the world of European high society was not merely a passage of age, but a revelation of presence. She was still young, yet the salons of Paris and London opened their doors, compelled as much by her fortune as by her wit. In these rooms filled with perfume and smoke, Daisy began to shape her legend. She did not wait to be introduced, nor did she lean upon the weight of her inheritance. Instead, she observed, she listened, and when she spoke, her words cut cleanly through the air, as though she had rehearsed them all her life in the echoing silence of her childhood halls. To the unprepared, her remarks could be devastating. A woman's gown dismissed with a single phrase, a man's ambitions undone by a subtle jest. Her tongue was as precise as a jeweler's tool, cutting away pretense to reveal vanity. Yet there was music in her cruelty, for laughter often followed, and those who were wounded returned again, unable to resist the brilliance that accompanied the sting. Was this not the paradox of Daisy Fellows, that she could wound and enchant in the same breath, leaving her companions unsure whether they had been honored or humiliated? The great houses of Paris, the soirée along the Thames, all seemed stages upon which Daisy performed. She learned quickly that presence was a form of power, and that power could be multiplied when laced with unpredictability. She wore gowns that startled, jewels that commanded attention, colors that defied expectation. Where others adhered to the safe elegance of tradition, Daisy dared to appear in costumes that seemed to mock convention while outshining it. She was not merely dressed, she was armored, and each ensemble became a statement. She would not be overlooked. And yet, beneath the laughter she provoked and the admiration she gathered, there remained the half-finished smile, a sign of something withheld. Was it loneliness that lingered in the curve of her mouth, or calculation, or the simple knowledge that admiration was as fragile as glass? Those who watched her closely saw the flicker of something unsaid, the shadow of absence that had never left her since childhood. Perhaps this was the source of her magnetism. She was dazzling, but never entirely present, always holding something in reserve, a promise that kept others leaning closer, hungry for a glimpse of the secret she concealed. Among her peers, there were some who adored her wit, others who feared it, and still more who resented her intrusion into their carefully preserved circles. But Daisy thrived in the tension. She seemed to draw strength from opposition, her remarks sharper when challenged, her elegance more audacious when criticized. Where another young woman might have retreated into meekness, Daisy advanced, unyielding, her half-smile daring anyone to dismiss her. The century itself was shifting, and she embodied its contradictions. In the streets, modernity was roaring forward. Machines, inventions, ideas that unsettled the old order. In the salons, aristocracy clung to its rituals, fearing irrelevance. Daisy stood at the intersection, part heiress of industrial wealth, part inheritor of noble title, yet neither wholly accepted nor wholly excluded. She belonged everywhere and nowhere, a figure both insider and intruder, and in this liminal space she carved her own domain, where wit was crown and beauty was scepter. Her evenings were filled with light and murmurs, yet her nights, one imagines, were quieter. Behind closed doors, jewels returned to their cases, gowns laid across chairs, mirrors reflecting only her own face. She may have felt again the silence of her youth. Did she look into those mirrors and see only the smile that never finished, wondering if even her brilliance could dissolve the echo of footsteps walking away? Or did she revel in her reflection, finding solace in the power she now commanded? History does not tell us, but the image lingers, a woman poised between triumph and solitude. At the heart of her early years in society lay the dance between belonging and rebellion. She knew the steps of etiquette, the phrases required for conversation, but she bent them to her will, introducing wit where others expected flattery, daring where they demanded obedience. Each gesture, each remark seemed to carry both defiance and grace, as though she were weaving her own tapestry from threads others had discarded. The salons could not resist her, for she offered something rare, the shock of cruelty wrapped in the elegance of beauty, and so the half-finished smile grew into a signature, a signal to those around her that they were stepping into a game where the rules were hers to decide. The ballroom, with its glittering chandeliers, became a theater, and Daisy, though not yet the reigning queen, had already begun her ascent. The music softened, the dancers paused, and the air seemed to tremble with anticipation. At the edge of the room, the half-smile remained, a promise left unanswered, a secret still withheld. And in that moment of silence, a crystal glass was raised in a toast too long, its hollow clink echoing into the night, carrying Daisy forward into the next act of her life. The hollow clink of the crystal glass lingered too long, a sound that carried across the table like a faint accusation, hollow and brittle, almost mocking in its resonance. Around it sat the assembled guests, their smiles fixed, their words chosen with care, yet the silence that followed the toast seemed to weigh heavier than the wine in their glasses. Daisy, seated in her place, her chin lifted ever so slightly, allowed the sound to hang. She knew, as perhaps only she could, that silence could be more devastating than speech, that a pause could reveal more than laughter. It was in such moments that her presence deepened, that the half-smile sharpened into something almost imperceptible, a reminder that she would not be subdued by custom nor hidden in the shadow of lineage. It was in this atmosphere of brittle refinement that Daisy entered her first marriage, a union that was less the bloom of romance than the weaving of two great houses, a calculation measured in fortunes and titles. She was wed to Jean de Broglie, a man of noble standing descended from lines that prided themselves on their antiquity. For Daisy, whose wealth derived from the modern miracle of industry, this marriage offered her entry into the older blood of Europe, a place where her Singer inheritance could be given the patina of nobility. Yet if the union looked perfect in the eyes of society, inside its polished walls there stirred another reality, less polished, less forgiving. The ceremony itself unfolded with grandeur, its details preserved in the whispers of witnesses. There were flowers radiant in abundance, and music that floated through vaulted spaces as if to sanctify the alliance. Daisy appeared as she always would, elegant, composed, a figure whose beauty seemed carved as much as born. Yet behind her veil, perhaps there was the same silence of her childhood home, the unspoken recognition that marriage was less a matter of the heart than a performance upon which her future reputation depended. Did she feel love? Or was she, even then, resigned to treat marriage as another stage upon which she would play the role demanded of her, all the while keeping her secret smile, unfinished, hidden behind silks and jewels? The dinners that followed were long, filled with ritual, where noble relatives measured one another's words as carefully as their jewels. Daisy's sharp wit often flashed through the polished monotony, cutting into the endless recitations of lineage and duty. Some were delighted, others scandalized, but none could ignore her. Her husband, perhaps, was caught between pride in her brilliance and unease at her irreverence. The hollow clink of glasses seemed always to echo in those evenings, as if reminding the couple that though the table was filled, there remained an emptiness neither could name. Life as Madame de Broglie brought Daisy further into the heart of European high society, but it also revealed to her the confinement of its rituals. She was young, surrounded by luxury, yet restless. The noble world into which she had married valued obedience, appearance, and quiet elegance. But Daisy had no patience for quiet. She sought stimulation, excitement, the thrill of disruption. Perhaps she laughed too sharply at the wrong moment, or perhaps her eyes lingered too long on another man across the table. Each small defiance added to her reputation, a reputation both feared and adored. And yet, beneath the veneer of scandal, there was tragedy waiting. Jean de Broglie was not to remain her partner for long. Illness and frailty entered their union, and soon Daisy found herself a widow, left with children and with freedom wrapped in mourning veils. Widowhood arrived like a cold wind through an open window, unexpected yet bracing, and with it came the possibility of reinvention. Where another young widow might have retreated into quiet seclusion, Daisy stepped forward, her black garments becoming another kind of costume, another layer of performance. But in those first days of loss, before the reinvention took shape, there must have been sorrow, though the world rarely glimpsed it. Alone in her chamber, a black veil falling across her face, did she think again of her mother, lost in her own youth? Did she sense the repetition of absence, the echo of footsteps walking away once more? History records little of her grief, for Daisy did not wear it in public. What she showed instead was resolve, elegance sharpened by loss, cruelty made more precise by survival. The salons whispered of her beauty in mourning, of the way she entered rooms draped in black, her eyes gleaming with a fierceness that turned sorrow into allure. Men were drawn not only to her fortune, but to the magnetism of her presence. Women watched her with suspicion and admiration, and Daisy, now free of a husband's shadow, began to carve out her true position in the world. Widowhood, though born of loss, had given her what childhood had denied her: autonomy. The black veil slipped away in time, carried off perhaps by a draft from an open window, drifting like a shadow into the night. Beneath it, Daisy Fellows emerged anew, not the obedient bride, nor the sheltered daughter, but a woman who knew that society was her stage, and that she, more than anyone, understood the value of control. The crystal glasses still clinked at long dinners, but she no longer waited for their sound to define her. She had begun to master her own music, sharp, unpredictable, unforgettable. Outside, the streets of Paris carried on with their rhythm. Carriages, automobiles, the distant call of newsboys, the laughter of cafes. Inside, in the quiet of her chambers, the veil rested where she had cast it aside, its dark fabric stirring faintly in the evening breeze, as if reluctant to leave. The veil, cast aside, drifted gently in the draught of the open window, its black folds caught for a moment in the pale light of dusk before settling into stillness upon the floor. It was as though morning itself had slipped from her shoulders, leaving her uncovered, untethered, and poised upon the threshold of a new existence. Widowhood had entered her life with the hush of tragedy, but in its wake there came not submission, nor withdrawal, but a strange and fierce freedom. Daisy Fellows, still young, still luminous, found herself no longer bound by a husband's presence, no longer confined to the role of dutiful wife. The world that once sought to direct her course now stood before her like a hall of mirrors, reflecting back endless possibilities, each touched with risk, each glimmering with temptation. The image of her, dressed in mourning yet moving through the salons of Paris, is one that history remembers. Black fabric became not merely a sign of loss, but a kind of armor, rendering her more formidable, more alluring than before. Men saw in her the magnetism of sorrow transfigured into strength. Women saw the dangerous possibility of independence that grief had bestowed. It is said that she seemed more alive in widowhood than she had in marriage, her wit sharper, her style more daring, her presence more commanding. Was it grief transformed into vitality, or was it simply that sorrow had stripped away illusion, revealing the core of a woman determined to live as she chose? Society watched, fascinated and unsettled. A young widow of immense fortune might have been expected to retreat, to surround herself with family and piety, to move softly among the shadows of remembrance. But Daisy's shadow was cast long and bold across the boulevards and drawing rooms. She did not whisper her grief. She wore it with elegance, bending even sorrow into spectacle. Those who sought to pity her soon realized she had no need of pity. She was not diminished by her loss. She was amplified. In this season of transformation, Daisy began to discover the power of reinvention. Where once she had been known as Madame de Broglie, tethered to lineage not her own, she now stepped forward bearing her own name, her own fortune, her own legend in the making. She cultivated friendships with artists, designers, poets, figures who moved outside the rigid codes of the aristocracy and who found in her both a patron and a provocateur. To them, she was not merely an heiress, but a muse, a woman whose beauty carried an edge, whose wit demanded respect, whose presence could ignite or extinguish with a glance. Yet freedom came laced with solitude. Beneath the brilliance of her reinvention lay the quiet truth of absence. Alone in her chambers, her children sleeping in distant nurseries, the echo of footsteps returning to silence, she must have felt the chill of the night air pressing through the open window. The veil that had fallen to the floor remained there, an object of mourning and of memory. Did she glance at it as she prepared for yet another gathering, wondering for a moment if the freedom she felt was purchased too dearly? Or did she step past it without hesitation, already turning absence into a tool, loss into leverage? It is said that in these years, Daisy's wit grew more merciless. At dinners, her remarks were no longer merely clever. They were sharp enough to unsettle, precise enough to draw blood without leaving visible wounds. Some laughed uneasily, unsure whether they had been honored or mocked. Others admired her audacity, repeating her phrases long after she had left the room. Her words were like the veil drifting on the breeze, insubstantial, fleeting, yet capable of lingering in memory long after they had passed. Perhaps this was her true inheritance, more than fortune, more than title, the power of words wielded as both weapon and charm. Her presence in salons became indispensable. Hosts who feared her cruelty still sought her company, for her name carried a charge that enlivened every gathering. Fashion houses began to court her, designers eager to see their creations elevated by her fearless style. Daisy accepted, but never as a passive model. She wore what pleased her, what startled others, what defied expectation. Each gown, each jewel, each gesture became an assertion that she belonged to no one's narrative but her own. And yet the veil upon the floor remained, a reminder that freedom and loss are bound by the same thread. Widowhood had unshackled her, but it had also marked her. She was not the innocent girl of marble halls, nor the dutiful wife at a noble table. She was something rarer, something less easily categorized, a woman who had walked through absence and emerged unbowed. Her independence was not given. It was carved, shaped by grief into a form that unsettled and fascinated in equal measure. As the years passed, whispers of her independence turned to murmurs of scandal. There were affairs, discreet and indiscreet. Rumors traded like jewels across the salons of Paris and London. Men of influence and men of creativity fell into her orbit, drawn not only by her fortune but by the dangerous vitality that surrounded her. For Daisy, these liaisons were not mere indulgence, but experiments in freedom, each encounter a step further from the silence of her youth. If marriage had been duty, widowhood was liberty, and she seized it without apology. The salons glittered with candlelight. Voices rose and fell, laughter trembled like glass, and Daisy moved among them like the shifting flame of the chandelier itself, illuminating and consuming, dazzling and dangerous. She was no longer a woman marked by loss, but a figure who had begun to turn scandal into power. And still, in her chamber, the veil rested where it had fallen, its black fabric stirring faintly in the night air, waiting for the next gust of wind to carry it further from sight. The murmur of voices trailed behind her as she left yet another gathering, her perfume lingering, her remarks still echoing among those too polite to repeat them aloud. Outside, the night held its breath as she stepped into her carriage, the city lights glimmering upon her jewels, the shadow of the veil still present in the folds of her gown. The murmur of voices trailed behind her as she stepped out into the cool night, the hush of the salon fading into the clatter of carriage wheels waiting in the street. Inside, her name still lingered upon the lips of those she had dazzled, unsettled, or wounded with the sharpness of her tongue. Outside, beneath the gaslight that shimmered against the damp cobblestones, Daisy gathered the folds of her gown and moved forward as though the city itself were another ballroom, its shadows another kind of audience. The murmurs that followed her did not fade. They multiplied, spreading across Paris and London alike, growing into the rhythm of scandal that would come to define her presence. For in those years after her widowhood, Daisy did not simply return to society. She conquered it anew, armed with independence and sharpened by grief. No longer bound by the quiet expectations of marriage, she embraced the stage of high society with deliberate audacity. At soirees, she would arrive not merely adorned but armored, her gowns startling in color, her jewels chosen not for delicacy but for their ability to command attention. While other women dressed to flatter, Daisy dressed to unsettle, to provoke, to remind all who watched that she was not beholden to their rules. Her fashion was not mere vanity, it was declaration, and each declaration left its mark. The salons whispered, first with amusement, then with unease, then with reluctant admiration. Some declared her outrageous, others hailed her as brilliant, but none could remain indifferent. Daisy understood that in a world where women were too often reduced to silence or ornament, indifference was a fate worse than scandal. And so she embraced scandal as her instrument, wielding it with the same precision as her wit. If a remark cut too deeply, if a dress startled too boldly, if an affair whispered too loudly, so be it. She had learned early that attention, even sharpened by censure, was still a form of power. It was not only her presence that stirred talk, but her fearless pursuit of desire. In a time when propriety demanded discretion, Daisy allowed herself affairs that were anything but hidden. She seemed to take pleasure in the discomfort her actions caused, as if daring society to scorn her while still craving her company. Men who entered her orbit found themselves captivated, not merely by beauty or wealth, but by the danger that radiated from her. To be close to Daisy was to risk humiliation, yet also to touch brilliance. Few resisted, many returned, and each left behind another story whispered in salons, another thread woven into the scandal of her legend. Yet it would be too simple to say that she sought only to shock. Beneath the defiance lay a deeper truth. Daisy was restless, unfulfilled by the roles offered to her, unwilling to live within the narrow confines of duty. Her affairs were not simply indulgence, they were rebellion against the silence that had shaped her childhood, against the hollow rituals of aristocracy. Each liaison, each sharp remark, each audacious gown was a step further from the marble corridors of her youth, a refusal to ever again be left behind by the sound of retreating footsteps. But scandal, once embraced, is never still. It grows, it mutates, it demands more. Daisy began to find herself not only whispered about, but watched. Her every action dissected, her every word repeated. She was Muse to some, menace to others, and to many both at once. Writers began to sketch her in their journals, designers to model their creations upon her daring, painters to capture the glint in her eyes that was neither warmth nor cruelty alone, but something more complex, a restless hunger for control. To inspire was to command, and Daisy seemed to understand this better than most. Her wit, already famed, grew sharper still. At dinners, she could deflate a boast with a single phrase, expose a vanity with nothing more than a glance. She was merciless, but her cruelty was never dull. Those she wounded often laughed even as they bled, repeating her remarks long after she had left the room. It was said that to be mocked by Daisy was a kind of distinction, proof that one had been noticed, that one had existed in her field of vision, if only for a moment. And so the cycle deepened. The more she wounded, the more she was sought after, and the more she was sought, the sharper her tongue became. Still, one must wonder, did she ever tire of the performance? Did she ever retreat into her chambers, close the doors against the murmurs, and long for something quieter, something less brittle than scandal? History does not record her private thoughts, only the spectacle she presented. Yet the veil that had once slipped from her shoulders remained in memory, a silent reminder that beneath the brilliance of her reinvention lay the shadows of loss. Perhaps the murmur of voices trailing behind her was not only a chorus of admiration and censure, but also an echo of absence, reminding her always that power was born from loneliness as much as from beauty. In those years, Daisy became indispensable to high society, yet also feared within it. Her approval could elevate, her disdain could destroy. Fashion houses sought her as their muse, poets courted her as their subject, lovers pursued her as their conquest, and rivals cursed her as their tormentor. She was at once queen and executioner, adored and despised, necessary and unbearable. The salons no longer merely entertained her, they revolved around her, each gathering another chance to witness the brilliance and the menace of Daisy Fellows. And so the murmur of voices trailed behind her once more, following her from salon to carriage, from Paris to London, from night into dawn. The air seemed always to hold her perfume, the sound of her laughter, the sting of her words. Even as she disappeared into the night, society remained caught in her orbit, compelled to repeat her name, to reconstruct her remarks, to measure themselves against her merciless gaze. The carriage wheels carried her away, grinding against the wet cobblestones, their rhythm echoing through the streets, as though announcing not her departure, but her dominion. The wheels of the carriage ground against the wet cobblestones, their rhythm harsh and unrelenting, a sound that seemed to carry her forward into a future not yet defined. The city glistened with rain, lamps throwing halos of light onto slick stone, while the horse's breath clouded the air like smoke rising from a fire not fully extinguished. Daisy sat within, her figure poised, her eyes reflecting the fleeting glow of the streets, as though already imagining the next stage upon which she would perform. For though scandal had become her companion, society demanded alliances, and alliances still held their ancient power. Thus it was that Daisy entered her second marriage, one not of necessity but of strategy, not of affection but of conquest, with Prince de Ségan. The prince, heir to a lineage steeped in history, bore a name that resonated within the corridors of European nobility. For Daisy, already marked by fortune and scandal, the marriage offered something she had not yet secured, a title that could silence her detractors, a crown of legitimacy that could place her above the whispers. Heiress of the singer Fortune, widow of de Broglie, now to become Princess de Sagan, each step was another stone laid upon the foundation of her legend. Yet behind the grandeur, one must wonder, did she seek in this union companionship, or only the assurance that society could no longer dismiss her as merely wealthy? The wedding was a spectacle, as such unions always were, a display of lineage and wealth woven together in gold and lace. Guests arrived in their finest, jewels flashing, voices murmuring beneath vaulted ceilings. Daisy appeared radiant, her beauty sharpened by the years, her composure unshaken by the weight of ceremony. Yet beneath the veil and the crown, perhaps the unfinished smile lingered still, a reminder that her heart was not fully surrendered, that her vows were as much performance as promise. If love was present, it was veiled. If ambition was present, it was unveiled. The marriage, like many of its kind, was both alliance and contest. Prince de Sagan brought her the ancient nobility she had long hovered at the edges of. Daisy brought him immense wealth and a presence that could electrify any room. Together they formed a union that seemed unassailable, yet within its chambers there was tension. For Daisy was not a woman to submit quietly. Her wit did not soften. Her independence did not waver. The prince, accustomed perhaps to deference, found in his bride a force equal to his own pride, and the collision of these forces was inevitable. Their home became another stage, its halls filled with visitors eager to bask in their combined prestige. Yet while the prince represented tradition, Daisy represented disruption. She hosted with elegance, but her remarks carried the same merciless brilliance. Her style continued to unsettle. Her liaisons did not cease. Rumors clung to her even within marriage, and perhaps it was this that gave her both power and peril, the refusal to be contained, even by the title she had sought. Still, the title of Princess de Sagan was not without meaning. It elevated her above the mutterings of those who dismissed her as merely industrial wealth. It gave her a place among Europe's most illustrious names, a place from which she could not easily be dislodged. And Daisy wielded it with precision. When she entered a salon now, it was not only as heiress, not only as widow, not only as scandalous beauty, it was as a princess, draped not only in jewels but in the weight of history. The combination was irresistible, and society, even when it recoiled, was compelled to bend. And yet titles cannot soften loneliness, nor silence restlessness. Daisy's affairs continued. Her sharp remarks grew sharper, her wit more dangerous. She was not content to sit quietly beside her husband, nor to limit herself to the duties of rank. Instead, she carved her own path, often at his expense, sometimes at her own. Her allure lay in this refusal. She was not a possession, not a compliant princess, but a force in her own right, dazzling, uncontainable, cruel, and magnificent. In the salons, whispers followed. Could a prince truly master a woman who wielded words as weapons and turned scandal into art? Could Daisy ever truly be bound by love or duty, when her very essence seemed to resist the ties that others embraced? No one answered, for the answer was already evident in her presence. She was not mastered, she was not bound, she was Daisy, and the title she had acquired became not a cage, but another ornament she wore with the same fearless audacity as her gowns. There were evenings when the prince and princess appeared together, their figures radiant, their titles unassailable, and society saw in them a union of power. But even then, Daisy's gaze often seemed elsewhere, her smile unfinished, her wit directed not at her husband but at those who hovered nearby, eager for her attention, fearful of her disdain. The prince may have held her name in marriage, but her essence belonged only to herself, to the freedom she had carved from widowhood, to the scandal she embraced like a cloak of fire. And so the carriage wheels continued to grind against wet cobblestones, carrying her from palace to salon, from duty to desire, from legitimacy to scandal. The rhythm of her life was no longer set by tradition, but by her own defiance, each choice another turn of the wheel, another step further from silence, another step deeper into legend. The sound of those wheels echoed into the night, mingling with the hiss of rain upon stone, until they seemed to dissolve into another sound, the faint hiss of a perfume bottle uncorked, its fragrance rising into the air, sweet, intoxicating, lingering far longer than the moment itself. The faint hiss of the perfume bottle as it was uncorked lingered in the stillness, its fragrance rising slowly, winding through the air like an invisible ribbon. It clung to the fabrics, to the polished wood of the vanity, to the very air of the room, and followed her out into the corridors of society. Perfume, that most elusive of adornments, invisible yet unforgettable, became a symbol of Daisy's presence. She entered a salon as though carried by scent before she spoke a word, and when she departed, the air itself seemed reluctant to release her. It was this same quality, unseen yet undeniable, that marked her affairs, whispered across Paris and London, rumors that spread like fragrance through the halls of the elite. For Daisy's beauty and wit, sharpened by loss and emboldened by independence, drew not only admiration but desire. Men of power, artists, aristocrats, even those already bound by marriage fell into her orbit, unable to resist the dangerous allure she exuded. Some sought her fortune, others her beauty. But most were captured by the paradox that was Daisy, the cruelty that could wound and the elegance that could soothe, the flame that dazzled even as it threatened to consume. To be near her was to feel the thrill of risk, as if scandal itself were part of her charm. Yet Daisy did not enter these affairs meekly, nor did she submit to the expectations of romance. She pursued desire with the same precision she wielded in her wit, unapologetic, fearless, even cruel. Lovers discovered quickly that she was not to be possessed. To her, passion was not surrender but conquest, not a merging of two lives, but a contest in which she must remain unbroken. If she granted affection, it was fleeting. If she gave herself, it was with the unspoken reminder that she could withdraw at any moment, leaving the other to stumble in the shadow of absence. Her power lay not in devotion but in detachment, in the knowledge that she would not remain should the intrigue diminish. The salons feasted upon these stories. Whispers curled like smoke above candle-lit tables. Who was her current companion? What was whispered behind closed doors? Which husband had she unsettled with her gaze? Scandal became her signature, as much a part of her as the shocking hues she wore, or the sharpness of her remarks. And yet, even as the world gossiped, it admired. For Daisy's liaisons, though notorious, seemed never to diminish her. Where another woman might have been shunned, Daisy grew only more radiant, more necessary, as though her very defiance against the codes of society made her indispensable to them. But to reduce her to mere scandal is to miss the complexity of her desire. Daisy's affairs were not simply indulgence, nor idle rebellion. They were experiments in control, acts of resistance against the silence that had haunted her childhood, against the expectations that sought to bind her as wife or widow. Each lover was not only a companion, but a mirror, reflecting back her own hunger for freedom, her refusal to be diminished. And if cruelty often entered these encounters, it was cruelty sharpened by necessity, the cruelty of a woman determined never to be left behind, never to surrender the power she had carved for herself. One wonders, though, what she felt in the quiet that followed when the perfume lingered, but the lover was gone? Did she revel in her autonomy, satisfied by the freedom her choices secured? Or did she, for a moment, feel the echo of loneliness return, the same echo that had followed her since childhood, reminding her that freedom and solitude are twins, inseparable and unrelenting? History cannot say. The fragrance fades, but the memory remains, and perhaps Daisy herself lived always within that tension, both intoxicated by her independence and haunted by the emptiness it concealed. The paradox of her allure was this: she could devastate and yet inspire devotion. She could wound and yet become Muse. Designers looked to her for inspiration, captivated not only by her beauty, but by her fearless daring. Writers sharpened their pens upon her image, struggling to capture the complexity of a woman who was at once victim of loneliness and mistress of scandal. Painters tried to hold her in color, yet the glint of her eye, the unfinished smile, eluded every canvas. She was both too much and never enough, a woman who resisted being contained, even in art. Her marriage to Prince de Ségan did not shield her from these whispers. If anything, it magnified them. The title of princess made her more visible, her affairs more notorious, her presence more intoxicating. And yet the prince, for all his nobility, could not contain her. She was a figure who belonged not to the rigid codes of lineage, but to the restless energy of her own making. Her lovers came and went, but her legend grew. The perfume lingered in the air, sweet and intoxicating, and then dissolved, leaving behind only memory. So too did her affairs linger in the whispers of society, fading yet never disappearing, each replaced by another, each adding another layer to her myth. She was muse and menace, lover and destroyer, a woman who turned desire into art and scandal into power. And at the end of the evening, when the bottle was stoppered once more, the scent still clung to her skin, faint but insistent, as though reminding her that passion, once uncorked, can never be fully contained. The fragrance drifted down the corridors of her home, past the nursery doors where her daughters lay sleeping, unaware of the shadows and secrets that already bound their lives to hers. A door closed softly between generations, shutting out the lingering scent, and with it began another story. Daisy not as lover, not as princess, not as muse, but as mother. A role that would carry its own echoes of absence and its own cruel shadows. The door closed softly, its latch catching with a muted click, a sound so gentle it might have been mistaken for kindness, yet in its finality it carried the weight of distance. On one side lingered the fading trace of perfume, the laughter and sharpness of salons, the ceaseless rhythm of desire and scandal. On the other side lay the quiet of a nursery, shadows stretched across the walls, small breaths rising and falling in steady rhythm. Between these two worlds stood Daisy, a mother by blood, a stranger by disposition, her figure framed for a moment in the threshold before she moved away, leaving silence to settle where presence should have been. Her daughters grew within the shadow of her brilliance, and yet brilliance casts long, cold stretches where warmth cannot reach. To be a child of Daisy Fellows was to inherit not only wealth and name, but also the chill of her distance, the sharpness of her expectations. She was not a mother of soft lullabies and tender embraces. She was a mother of precision, of critique, of remarks delivered with the same merciless wit she wielded in society. Her gaze, so dazzling to strangers, could be withering to those closest to her, and the love that should have been balm often felt more like judgment. There are stories whispered of her coolness, of the way she measured her daughters not by affection but by appearance, by elegance, by the capacity to uphold the standard she herself had set. To her, beauty was both armor and weapon, and she expected her children to understand this truth without question. If a gown did not flatter, if a gesture faltered, if a word lacked wit, her disapproval was swift, her remarks cutting. What was left unspoken, perhaps, was any gentleness. The daughters, growing within her orbit, learned early that approval was conditional, that affection could vanish like perfume into air, leaving behind only the memory of what might have been. Yet to reduce Daisy to cruelty alone is to overlook the complexity of her maternal presence. She was not indifferent, nor wholly absent. She provided for her children, ensured their education, surrounded them with the trappings of privilege. But what she could not, or would not, give was softness. Her own mother had been taken from her too soon, leaving Daisy to grow among silence and echoes. Perhaps she believed that tenderness was a luxury too easily lost, that it was better to arm her daughters with sharpness than to lull them with comfort. Perhaps she feared that love, openly given, would only invite absence once more, and so she withheld it, offering instead the discipline of wit, the armor of elegance, the expectation of strength. The daughters, in turn, carried the weight of this inheritance in different ways. Some sought to mirror their mother's brilliance, adopting her elegance, her sharpness, her disregard for convention. Others recoiled, seeking refuge in lives quieter, less burdened by spectacle, yet all bore the mark of her distance, the wound of having been raised in the presence of brilliance, but not in the warmth of nurture. What was admiration to strangers was often intimidation to family, and what society celebrated as audacity. Her daughters may have felt as absence. Even in public, the dynamic was visible. At dinners or gatherings where Daisy appeared with her children, her remarks toward them carried the same edge she used on others, her wit sparing no one, not even those of her own blood. Laughter often followed, but beneath the laughter lay discomfort. For what guest does not sense when cruelty has been dressed as jest? Yet Daisy did not falter. To her, perhaps, this was education, a training in resilience, a lesson in survival within a world that devoured the weak. What others saw as coldness, she may have seen as necessity. Still, the door between generations remained closed, the latch clicking softly, over and over again. And what of Daisy herself? When the salons dimmed and the perfumes faded, did she ever pause at the threshold of her daughters' rooms, watching them sleep, their faces softened by dreams, untouched by her demands? Did she ever feel the urge to step inside, to press a hand upon a small forehead, to whisper a word of love that required no performance? History records no such moments, for Daisy did not live a life documented in tenderness. But absence, too, leaves its trace, and one wonders if she, alone at night, ever felt the echo of what she had withheld. Her children would grow, each carrying forward their own stories, their own struggles with the legacy of Daisy's presence. Some would suffer, some would rebel, some would seek to escape the weight of her name, and Daisy, for all her power in society, could not control the course of their lives, could not prevent the tragedies that unfolded in later years. In this, as in all things, her brilliance was shadowed by inevitability. Power can dazzle, wit can wound, beauty can command, but none can shelter those closest from the cruelties of time and fate. The nursery door, once closed, would one day open again, but by then the daughters were grown, and the distance that had taken root in childhood could not be erased. They carried within them both the glamour and the wounds of their mother's legacy, and society, always eager for scandal, would find in them echoes of Daisy's own contradictions. The fragrance of her perfume lingered upon them even when they wished to be free of it, for lineage is not a choice but a shadow. The door closed softly, and in the silence that followed, a fabric rustled faintly in the dark, as if memory itself had shifted. Beyond the door, in another room, a shimmer of shocking pink caught the dim light, a fabric unlike any other, bold, surreal, impossible to ignore, heralding the next chapter of Daisy's life as muse, as rival, as arbiter of a fashion that would astonish the world. The shimmer of shocking pink caught the dim light, a hue so audacious it seemed almost alive, breathing against the still air of the chamber. No soft blush, no delicate rose. This was a color invented to unsettle, to demand attention, to announce its presence with the insistence of a trumpet in a hushed cathedral. The fabric rustled faintly as though it whispered its own rebellion, and in that whisper stood the name of Elsa Schiaparelli, the designer who dared to drape the world in surrealism. And beside her, or perhaps just across from her, stood Daisy Fellows, muse and menace in equal measure, the heiress who made even scandal a crown. Their relationship was a dance between admiration and rivalry, a performance that society watched with fascination. Daisy, already famed for her fearlessness and style, found in Schiaparelli a partner willing to clothe her in the language of daring. While others hesitated at the threshold of innovation, Daisy stepped boldly into it, carrying garments that seemed less like clothing and more like declarations of defiance. She was among the first to embrace Schiaparelli's creations, and in doing so, she transformed them from eccentric curiosities into emblems of audacity. Yet admiration was never simple in Daisy's world, for if she lifted Schiaparelli into the spotlight, she also overshadowed her, embodying the design so completely that many wondered where the couturière ended and the heiress began. It was Daisy who first wore shocking pink in its purest, most startling form, a shade that became Schiaparelli's signature and Daisy's symbol. The color clung to her with the force of inevitability, as though it had always waited for her to give it life. When she entered a salon draped in that impossible hue, conversation faltered, glasses paused mid-air, and even chandeliers seemed dim in comparison. Some called it vulgar, others divine, but no one could look away. And was this not precisely what Daisy desired? Not approval, not comfort, but the assurance that she would never be ignored? Yet beneath the brilliance of collaboration lay the undercurrent of rivalry. Daisy was not a passive canvas upon which Schiaparelli painted her vision. She was a woman who demanded control, who bent garments to her will, who wore them not to honor the designer, but to amplify her own legend. The muse threatened to eclipse the artist, and whispers began to circle. Was Daisy the embodiment of Schiaparelli's genius, or was Schiaparelli merely a vessel through which Daisy extended her reign? The answer, as with so much of Daisy's life, remained unresolved, a tension that flickered like the shimmer of shocking pink itself. The Salons delighted in this tension. To see Daisy in one of Schiaparelli's creations was to witness spectacle, to feel the air crackle with provocation. Hats shaped like shoes, gowns adorned with trompe-l'oeil details, jewelry that mimicked bones or insects. On another woman they might have seemed absurd, but on Daisy they became inevitable. Her poise, her merciless wit, her disdain for convention, all combined to make the surreal credible, the scandalous sublime. Society gasped, and then it imitated, for Daisy's defiance often became tomorrow's fashion. But admiration is never without envy, and envy is never without cruelty. Daisy's tongue, sharp as ever, did not spare even those who clothed her. Her remarks toward Schiaparelli could be as cutting as toward her rivals, mocking her eccentricities even as she embraced her designs. Perhaps this cruelty was a test, a way to assert dominance, to remind the world that even as muse, she remained sovereign. Or perhaps it was simply Daisy's nature to turn even admiration into contest, to ensure that no one, not even a visionary designer, could stand entirely unscathed in her orbit. And what of Schiaparelli herself? Did she see in Daisy a friend, a collaborator, or a rival who threatened to consume her creations? Perhaps she saw all three at once. For every time Daisy appeared draped in shocking pink, it was both a triumph and a surrender. Triumph, for the world saw her art made flesh. Surrender, for the flesh was Daisy's, and the legend belonged not to the couturière but to the woman who wore it. It was a rivalry without resolution, a friendship edged with competition, a partnership defined by brilliance and shadow alike. The fashion world, like the Salons, thrived on such paradox. It was not enough to admire. It had to speculate, to whisper, to compare. Who held the greater power, the designer or the muse? Who shaped the other more deeply, the one who created or the one who embodied? In this, as in so much of her life, Daisy blurred the lines, leaving no clear answer, only the lingering shimmer of a fabric that seemed to move even when still. Her daughters, watching from the edges, must have seen their mother transformed again, no longer only a princess, a widow, a lover, but now also a symbol of fashion itself, a woman whose presence dictated the course of couture. Yet for them, perhaps, the sight carried another layer, the recognition that their mother's brilliance was also her absence, her elegance another form of distance. For shocking pink may dazzle the eye, but it offers little warmth. The salons continued to murmur, the fashion houses to bow, the artists to sketch, and Daisy to glide through it all, her unfinished smile hidden beneath colors too bold for convention, too sharp for comfort. She was muse and menace, clothed in fabrics that spoke louder than words, garments that turned her body into spectacle, her presence into art. And as she moved, the shocking pink shimmered still, catching the light as if it were fire in fabric form, burning brightly, never fading, always demanding to be seen. The quill paused in midair, ink trembling at its tip, as though the writer who sought to capture her in words found himself halted, uncertain how to define a woman who was at once creation and creator, muse and destroyer. The ink dripped, a single dark stain upon the page, and with it began another chapter. Daisy, not as figure of fashion but as writer herself, wielding words with the same cruelty and elegance as she wielded wit in salons. The quill trembled in midair, a bead of ink swelling at its tip until it dropped onto the waiting page, a small black mark that spread slowly into the fibers. It was the hesitation before the stroke, the moment when thought and word wrestle in silence. Daisy Fellows, so accustomed to commanding with her voice, her gaze, her attire, now sought to command with ink. She bent over her desk, the light of a single lamp casting her shadow across the paper, and began to write. What emerged was not confession nor sentiment, but satire, sharpened as finely as any remark she had ever delivered across a dinner table. Her novel, Les Dimanches de la Comtesse de Narbonne, became another mask she wore, another weapon she wielded, another echo of her unfinished smile pressed into permanence by words. The world knew Daisy for her cruelty spoken aloud, for the ease with which she could dismantle vanity with a phrase. In her writing, she refined this cruelty into art. The pages of her novel glimmered with the same merciless wit that marked her in salons, turning society into caricature, exposing its emptiness, its hypocrisies, its ridiculous devotion to appearance. She knew the world she mocked intimately, for she inhabited it, and her words cut all the more deeply because they were not imagined, but observed. The Comtesse of her novel was both invention and mirror, a figure who revealed the absurdities of a class that clung desperately to relevance even as modernity pulled the ground from beneath its feet. Those who read it felt both delight and unease. They laughed at her jests, nodded at her insights, yet could not help but wonder if they themselves had been seen, if some quirk of their manner, some vanity of their dress, had been immortalized in her satire. To be written about by Daisy was both distinction and danger, for her words spared no one, and her pen was as merciless as her tongue. Friends found themselves exposed, rivals ridiculed, strangers skewered, all with a precision that seemed effortless. She had turned her gaze, once confined to the drawing room, onto the page, and in doing so, she revealed what society had always feared, that it was nothing more than theater, and that she, Daisy, remained its cruelest critic and most dazzling performer. But what drove her to write? Was it boredom, a desire for another stage upon which to perform? Or was it something deeper, the recognition that wit spoken aloud drifts away with the laughter, while wit written down lingers, survives, outlives even its speaker? Perhaps she understood that scandal fades but words endure, and in her novel she sought not only to mock, but to ensure her voice carried beyond the salons, into the quieter libraries where memory takes root. In this way, her cruelty became legacy, her wit transformed into permanence. And yet, for all its brilliance, her writing bore the same paradox as her life. It dazzled, but it also distanced. It entertained, but it did not comfort. It revealed, but it did not reconcile. Readers admired the sharpness of her observations, but found little warmth, little humanity beneath the glitter of satire. Perhaps this was intentional, for Daisy had never sought to soothe. She sought to command, to unsettle, to remind the world that it could not look away. If her book lacked tenderness, it was because tenderness had long been absent from her life, replaced instead with the sharp edges of survival and the relentless pursuit of presence. Still, one must imagine her in those late hours, alone with ink and paper, her daughters sleeping, the salons temporarily silent. Did she find solace in the act of writing, in shaping words with the same precision as she chose her gowns and her jewels? Did she ever allow the page to hold what she withheld from the world, her loneliness, her doubts, the echo of footsteps that had always haunted her? Or did the page, too, become another mask, another performance, another way of ensuring that even in solitude she remained untouchable? The ink stain on the paper, spreading slowly, gives no answer. Her novel, though a single work, solidified her reputation not only as a figure of fashion and scandal, but also as an intellect, a writer capable of turning society inside out with nothing more than a phrase. To those who dismissed her as frivolous, she offered proof of depth. To those who envied her, she offered another reason for resentment. To those who admired her, she became still more formidable. The heiress, the princess, the widow, the muse, the lover. Now also the satirist, her pen an extension of her presence. The salons whispered about her book just as they whispered about her gowns and her affairs. Some praised her daring, others condemned her cruelty, but none could ignore her. The words lingered long after the laughter faded, like perfume trapped in fabric, impossible to wash away. And in this, Daisy achieved what she always sought. She remained unforgettable. The quill rested at last, laid carefully upon the desk, its tip darkened with the residue of ink. The lamp flickered, casting long shadows across the room, as though her words had already begun to echo beyond its walls. Somewhere outside, the sound of carriages faded into silence, and inside the pages rustled faintly as though alive, as though mocking in their own voice the world they described. The chandelier above swayed gently, its crystals trembling in the draught, scattering fragments of light across the ceiling. The laughter of salons, the murmur of voices, the endless clink of glasses, all seemed to echo within those trembling prisms. And Daisy, having set her words into permanence, prepared once more to step into the role she had never abandoned. Queen of high society, both muse and menace, arbiter of elegance and cruelty alike. The chandelier swayed gently, its crystals trembling in the draught, scattering 1,000 points of fractured light across the ceiling. Each flicker seemed to echo with the memory of laughter that had just subsided, laughter which carried both delight and unease, the laughter that often followed Daisy's words. In those prisms of light hung the essence of the 1930s, an age when salons glimmered against the looming shadows of uncertainty, when the world danced feverishly even as storms gathered at the horizon, and at the very heart of this fragile brilliance sat Daisy Fellows, reigning over high society with a presence that was both dazzling and merciless. By this decade, her legend was complete. No longer merely the heiress, the widow, or the scandalous beauty, Daisy had become something larger, something almost mythic. In Paris and London alike, her name alone could ignite anticipation. Hosts vied for her presence, knowing that her arrival would transform their gatherings into events worth remembering. Designers shaped gowns with her in mind, jewelers set stones imagining her wearing them, and writers filled their notebooks with sketches of her remarks. To be seen with Daisy was to be illuminated by her aura. To be scorned by her was to risk obscurity. She arrived at Salons as though she were not entering but ascending a stage, her gowns shocking in color, her jewels chosen not for modest beauty but for audacity. A necklace might appear almost too heavy, a brooch too bold, but upon Daisy they became inevitabilities, as if society itself had bent to her daring. She did not flatter fashion, she commanded it. Elsa Schiaparelli, Chanel, and others competed for her allegiance, and she, never one to submit, selected only what suited her, always with the unspoken reminder that she elevated the garment, not the other way around. Her wit remained her crown. Guests gathered near her not out of affection but anticipation, for to hear one of Daisy's remarks was to witness artistry. A compliment might conceal a barb, a jest might reveal a truth too sharp for comfort. She could reduce an entire table to silence with a single phrase, or provoke peals of uneasy laughter that rippled across the room like glass trembling upon a tray. Some dreaded her presence, fearing her eye might fall upon them, yet those same guests felt cheated if she ignored them. To be wounded by Daisy was perversely to be noticed, and to be noticed was a kind of distinction. And yet, beneath the spectacle, there was calculation. Daisy understood better than anyone that society thrived upon theater. In an age when the old orders were crumbling, when fortunes faltered and politics threatened upheaval, salons served as sanctuaries of illusion, places where chandeliers still glittered and gowns still dazzled. But illusions require belief, and belief requires figures strong enough to sustain it. Daisy, with her fearless style and her merciless wit, became one such figure, a living emblem of elegance that refused to yield, even as the world outside grew uncertain. She was at once the mask and the truth, reminding her peers that decadence could still endure, even if only for an evening. The 1930s were years of contrasts, jazz spilling from radios, surrealism reshaping art, the hum of modernity rising alongside whispers of conflict. Daisy seemed to embody these contradictions, at once modern and aristocratic, frivolous and ruthless, muse and menace. She entertained princes and painters alike, moved as easily among royalty as among artists, and yet never seemed to belong fully to either. She was her own creation, untouchable, uncontainable, always just beyond the grasp of definition. Her daughters, by now older, must have watched with complex eyes, seeing their mother elevated to heights few could imagine, yet also seeing the cost. For Daisy's brilliance was demanding, her presence relentless, her cruelty never spared even in private. To be her child was to live in the orbit of a star so bright it left little room for one's own light. And yet, in the eyes of society, Daisy's motherhood was an afterthought, overshadowed by her role as arbiter of style and wit. The salons remembered her barbs. The fashion houses remembered her daring. Few remembered her daughters waiting quietly in the shadows. But Daisy did not dwell upon shadows. She thrived upon illumination. Each evening was another opportunity to command attention, another chance to sharpen her legend. And society, complicit in its fascination, gave her what she demanded. They whispered of her cruelty but sought her company. They mocked her audacity but imitated her style. They feared her remarks but repeated them endlessly. She was the axis upon which their glittering world turned, even as cracks began to show in its foundation. Yet what of Daisy herself in the quiet after the chandeliers dimmed, when the laughter faded and the gowns were unpinned? Did she feel triumph at her dominion, or did she feel the echo of the silence that had always haunted her? Did she glance at her reflection, noting the perfection of jewels and fabrics, and wonder if the brilliance was armor too heavy to remove? History does not answer. It leaves us only with the image of her seated beneath swaying chandeliers, her smile unfinished, her gaze steady, her presence commanding, while beyond the walls of the salon the world shifted inexorably toward war. The crystals of the chandelier trembled once more, scattering light like fragments of memory, and in their shimmer there appeared the shadow of a crown resting upon a polished table, a faint outline of power, authority, and exile that would soon intertwine with Daisy's own orbit as she encountered the Windsors, Chanel, Dali, and others whose names carried both brilliance and scandal. Upon the polished surface of the table, the faint shadow of a crown seemed to rest, not tangible, not real, yet present in the imagination of all who gathered around it. It was a symbol of power that had slipped, of royalty unsettled, of exile dressed in jewels. Daisy Fellows, already queen of salons by wit and audacity, found herself in the company of those who bore titles not by choice, but by history. The Duke and Duchess of Windsor, whose abdication had turned love into scandal and sovereignty into memory. The shadow of their crown lay across every table they touched, and Daisy, with her sharp gaze, sat near them, weighing both their elegance and their disgrace. The Windsors embodied much of what fascinated Daisy. They were figures at once adored and despised, clinging to relevance through spectacle, shaping their lives into theater that Europe could not look away from. To Daisy, this must have felt familiar, for she too lived at the intersection of admiration and scandal, thriving upon the tension between cruelty and charm. Conversations with the Duchess, whose style rivaled Daisy's own, were layered with rivalry as much as camaraderie. Did Daisy admire her, or did she dismiss her as another woman striving too visibly for distinction? Perhaps both at once, for admiration and disdain often mingled in Daisy's regard, each heightening the other, each making her observations more merciless. The Duke, polite and elegant, carried himself with a wistfulness that Daisy could not have failed to notice. He had given away his throne for love, a gesture at once romantic and reckless, a decision that fascinated society as much as it unsettled it. Daisy, who turned scandal into armor, must have regarded him with both intrigue and skepticism. To sacrifice power for passion was a choice she herself would never have made. Her liaisons, her affairs, her audacity. None of these ever threatened her command. She took what she desired without relinquishing what she possessed. Perhaps, as she watched the Duke smile faintly across a table, she thought not of romance but of folly, not of devotion but of weakness. Yet she entertained them as they entertained her, for they were alike in their necessity. Creatures of spectacle, dependent on society's fascination, sustained by whispers and by the inevitability of their presence. In the glittering salons where they appeared, Daisy stood as their equal, her fortune and wit balancing the weight of their lost crown. Together they formed a constellation of scandal that gleamed against the uncertain sky of Europe. But Daisy's orbit extended beyond royalty. She moved also among creators, those who bent art and fashion into forms both shocking and sublime. Elsa Schiaparelli had already clothed her in surrealism, but others sought her too. Coco Chanel, elegant in her restraint, regarded Daisy with a mixture of admiration and disdain. Chanel's designs, pared down and timeless, contrasted with Daisy's taste for extravagance and Schiaparelli's surreal daring. When Daisy wore Chanel, she transformed it, adding jewels so audacious they nearly mocked the simplicity of the garment. Was Chanel offended, or did she secretly admire Daisy's refusal to submit even to fashion's dictates? Their encounters, whispered about in salons, were like duels fought not with swords but with fabrics and stones, each woman asserting her command in a world that often denied women power of any kind. And then there were the artists, the dreamers of the avant-garde. Salvador Dali, with his mustache like a drawn flourish, painted worlds that defied reason, melted time, and clothed imagination in extravagance. In Daisy, he found both subject and mirror. She, like his art, unsettled by her very existence, made the absurd seem inevitable, the shocking seem elegant. When Daly sketched her, did he see the cruelty in her smile, the loneliness in her eyes, the surreal paradox of a woman who was at once muse and menace? Perhaps for his portraits captured not the surface, but the distortion beneath. And Daisy was distortion incarnate, a child of absence, a queen of scandal, a woman whose very presence blurred the line between beauty and danger. These encounters were not mere accidents of society. They were the weaving of a tapestry in which Daisy's life intersected with the great figures of her age. Royals, designers, artists, all found themselves caught in her orbit. All felt the sting of her remarks, the force of her style, the inevitability of her presence. And Daisy, for her part, used them as she used everyone, as mirrors, as foils, as instruments through which her legend could be amplified. The Duke and Duchess of Windsor brought her proximity to lost crowns. Chanel and Schiaparelli offered her garments with which to stage her defiance. Daly gave her the aura of surreal immortality. Together they formed the chorus to her solo, the setting against which her brilliance was sharpened. Yet even as she moved among them, one must wonder what she thought in solitude. Did she envy the Windsors their devotion, even as she mocked its folly? Did she admire Chanel's discipline, even as she flaunted extravagance in her face? Did she recognize in Dali's distorted clocks the passage of time that even she could not arrest? The chandelier crystals above the salons swayed gently, scattering fractured light, but beneath the glitter there was always the shadow of the crown upon the table, the reminder that power, beauty, brilliance, all are subject to time, to exile, to loss. The shadow lengthened, stretched across the table, and at its edge stood Daisy, poised as ever, her smile unfinished, her eyes gleaming. Beyond the salons, beyond the laughter and the whispers, the world trembled on the brink of change. War clouds gathered, trains waited at stations, borders hardened. The music of society faltered, but still the shadow of the crown remained, heavy upon the polished surface, as though foreshadowing the turbulence that would soon engulf even those who believed themselves untouchable. And into that shadow rose the sound of a whistle, sharp and distant, the call of a train preparing to depart, carrying with it secrets, loyalties, and the shifting destinies of those who had once reigned in salons alone. The whistle of the train cut through the night, a sound sharp and mournful, echoing across the damp platforms where travelers gathered their belongings in haste, where soldiers embraced wives and mothers before stepping into carriages bound for uncertainty. That whistle, fading into the distance, carried with it the premonition of fracture, of a Europe about to be torn apart. The salons of Paris, once glittering with laughter, began to dim, their chandeliers swaying not with merriment, but with the tremor of unease. And among those who watched the world shift was Daisy Fellows, who had built her reign upon scandal and wit, now confronted with an age where elegance itself seemed endangered. War has a way of revealing the fragility of masks. For Daisy, whose life had been a series of carefully constructed performances, the coming conflict posed questions that even her sharp tongue could not easily dismiss. Whispers began to follow her, not of affairs or gowns, but of loyalties. The very salons that had once repeated her barbs now murmured about allegiances, collaboration, survival. Paris was no longer merely a stage for fashion and wit. It became a chessboard of politics, resistance, and betrayal. And Daisy, with her title, her fortune, her connections, found herself under the gaze of those who demanded to know, where did she stand? Some claimed she moved easily among those who occupied Paris, that her salons remained open to German officers, that her wit spared no hesitation even in the company of power wearing unfamiliar uniforms. Others insisted she despised them in silence, using her presence as a shield to protect her own circle. Her words sharpened not against the occupiers, but against the hypocrisy of those who once adored her. The truth, as ever with Daisy, remains obscured, hidden within that unfinished smile, her motives impossible to pin down. Was she a collaborator, a survivor, a cynic who treated war as she treated society, another stage upon which to perform? What is certain is that Daisy did not vanish. She remained visible, her presence still noted, her name still whispered. Even in war, scandal followed her, as though the world needed her audacity to remind itself that life continued, however distorted. Her gowns grew darker, her jewels less ostentatious, yet her presence was no less formidable. She seemed to move through the occupied city with the same composure she had brought to the salons of peace, her eyes unflinching, her remarks no less merciless. Perhaps it was survival. Perhaps it was defiance. Perhaps it was simply Daisy, refusing ever to be diminished, even by war. The city itself reflected her contradictions. Paris, under occupation, was both subdued and defiant, filled with silence and with secrets. Cafes still poured coffee, though it was bitter with scarcity. Theaters still performed, though under watchful eyes. Fashion still flickered, though rationed and restrained. Daisy moved within this landscape like a ghost of the old world, reminding those who saw her that elegance could endure even under shadow. Yet her elegance was not without cost, for in times of suffering, extravagance appears as cruelty, and wit can become venom. What had once been admired as audacity was now judged as indifference, and whispers turned to accusations. Her daughters, too, lived through these years, their own fates entwined with the turbulence of war. Did Daisy offer them protection, or did her distance remain even as bombs fell and soldiers marched? It is difficult to say. She had never been a mother of comfort, and war likely hardened her further. Perhaps she believed that survival itself was enough of a gift, that tenderness was still a luxury she could not provide. In this, as in all things, her legacy remained double-edged, sharp as the quill she once dipped into ink, sharp as the jewels she wore across her throat. There were evenings when the war seemed far away, when gatherings continued in dimmed salons, when glasses clinked softly though laughter did not rise as freely. Daisy sat among them, her presence both anchor and threat, her remarks filling the silence that others feared to break. But even then, the sound of trains lingered in memory, carrying away neighbors, carrying away friends, carrying away the illusion that the world could remain untouched. The whistle that once called lovers to adventure now called families to exile, and the polished tables upon which crowns once cast their shadows now bore only the weight of absence. And through it all, Daisy endured. She did not falter, at least not outwardly. She appeared, she dressed, she spoke, she survived. But survival is not without ambiguity. When the war ended, when Paris breathed again, her reputation carried with it the stains of rumor. Some whispered that she had been too close to power, too comfortable in its company. Others argued that she had simply done what was necessary, that she had maintained her place in a world determined to erase her. The truth dissolved like perfume in the air, leaving only speculation, leaving only the certainty that Daisy had remained, as always, unforgettable. The whistle of the train faded at last, lost in the distance, but its echo lingered in memory. It carried with it the sound of absence, of exile, of choices made and unmade. And when silence settled once more upon the city, Daisy emerged again, her presence altered but unbroken, her crown of wit still gleaming, though tarnished at the edges. The dining tables were set once more, the salons reopened, the chandeliers lit. Yet at the head of the table there stood an empty chair, a reminder of those who had not returned, of voices silenced, of laughter that would not echo again. And it was into this silence, heavy and unresolved, that Daisy once more lifted her glass, her smile unfinished, her gaze unyielding, prepared to reign again in a world forever changed. The empty chair at the long dining table stood like a monument, silent and immovable, its vacancy speaking louder than any guest who might have filled it. Around it, the clink of silverware resumed, conversation stuttered and then recovered. Chandeliers spilled their fractured light once more, yet the absence remained. Paris, after the war, was a city haunted by such chairs, by such silences, and Daisy Fellows, seated among the survivors of salons and families, carried on her reign in a world altered, diminished, yet still hungry for spectacle. She had endured the war as she endured all things, with composure that appeared unshaken, with wit that refused to dull, with elegance that seemed at once defiance and disguise. Yet the glamour she once wielded like a weapon now bore the faint tarnish of time. The whispers that followed her were no longer only of affairs or gowns, but of choices made under occupation, of loyalties questioned, of friendships broken. The society that had once bowed to her brilliance now regarded her with a mixture of fascination and suspicion. She remained indispensable, but her dominion was no longer unchallenged. In the post-war years, fashion itself changed, as though echoing the need for renewal. The extravagance of the 1930s gave way to the restraint of Dior's new look, a silhouette that seemed to mourn the losses while rebuilding beauty from simplicity. Daisy, once muse of surrealism and shock, adapted with the same fearless audacity, but her role was shifting. She was no longer the figure who dictated the direction of style. She was the emblem of an era now receding into memory. Designers still courted her. Artists still admired her. Yet younger women, with fresher faces and post-war vitality, began to occupy the spaces she once commanded effortlessly. Still, Daisy refused to be erased. She appeared at gatherings with jewels that seemed almost defiant in their brilliance, as though to insist that time had not diminished her power. Her remarks, though now tinged with age, lost none of their cruelty. If anything, they grew sharper, stripped of the restraint that time sometimes bestows. Guests continued to laugh uneasily, continued to repeat her words long after she had departed, continued to seek her company even as they dreaded it. The paradox of Daisy remained: feared, resented, admired, necessary. Her daughters, now grown, lived their own stories, carrying the weight of her presence even in her absence. Some bore the wounds of her coldness more deeply as adults than they had as children, finding in their own lives the echoes of her distance. The tragedies that touched them could not be prevented by fortune or title, and Daisy, for all her brilliance, could not shield them. Perhaps she did not know how. Perhaps she did not believe tenderness had power in a world so cruel. In this, her legacy was double-edged. She gave her daughters wealth and name, but also the shadow of her own mercilessness. The door between generations remained closed, the latch still catching softly. In society, Daisy's name continued to carry weight. The salons that survived the war sought her presence, for even diminished brilliance casts light. She remained a figure of legend, her past scandals retold with nostalgia, her cruelty remembered with a kind of reverence. Younger women imitated her style, but none could replicate the essence of her paradox. For Daisy was not merely fashionable, she was formidable. And formidability, once established, does not fade easily. Yet behind the chandeliers and the laughter, one imagines her moments of solitude growing longer, her reflections more frequent. Did she glance at the empty chairs, the absences that multiplied with each year, and feel the weight of memory pressing against her defiance? Did she wonder if her brilliance had been armor too heavy, if her cruelty had left her surrounded by admirers, but deprived of intimacy? These questions linger like the echo of a glass set down upon a polished table, faint yet unresolved. Paris moved forward, the world moved forward, but Daisy remained both part of it and apart from it. She attended, she observed, she commanded, but she no longer defined. Her legend, forged in scandal and audacity, began to harden into memory even as she still walked among those who whispered her name. In this, there was both triumph and tragedy. Triumph, for she had achieved what she always sought, to be unforgettable. Tragedy, for to be unforgettable is not the same as to be beloved. The empty chair at the table remained, its silence a reminder that time spares no one, not even those who once seemed untouchable. And as the laughter of the evening faded, the mirror upon the wall began to cloud with age, its silver backing worn, its reflection blurred, as though unwilling to return a clear image to the woman who stood before it. The mirror clouded with age, its once bright surface mottled by time, returning only fragments of the woman who gazed into it. Lines blurred, colors softened, and where once she had seen her beauty reflected with merciless clarity, Daisy Fellows now saw distortion. Yet even in that distortion, there was a kind of defiance, for she had never sought tenderness in her reflection, only confirmation of her presence, her command, her refusal to fade. The mirror, though clouded, still returned her outline, and perhaps that was enough. In her later years, Daisy grew sharper, her wit cutting more deeply, her remarks more cruel. Age, which softened some, seemed only to harden her, as though each passing year filed her words into finer blades. Guests who once feared her barbs now feared them more, for there was no longer the distraction of youth to soften the sting. Her cruelty, stripped of glamour, revealed itself more plainly, and yet society still laughed, still repeated her words, still sought her company, unable to resist the magnetism of a woman who had become legend even as she lived. She wore her jewels still, heavy and audacious, as though to defy the passage of time. Necklaces that weighed upon her shoulders, rings that caught the light with almost mocking brilliance, brooches set so boldly they seemed designed to remind the world that she remained. Her gowns, though chosen with care, now carried the memory of decades past, fabrics that whispered of a world before war, before loss, before age itself had begun its relentless conquest. And yet, when she entered a room, heads still turned, not with the same awe as before, but with a reverence reserved for relics, for figures whose names had outlived their contemporaries. Her remarks toward those around her grew infamous. A friend might confide sorrow, only to receive a jest so merciless it left them silent. A younger woman might appear in a gown, only to be dismissed with a phrase that traveled through salons like wildfire. Daisy seemed to take pleasure in reminding the world that she had not softened, that she remained capable of cruelty as dazzling as her jewels. Perhaps she feared that without cruelty, she would be forgotten, that kindness would render her invisible. Perhaps cruelty was the only language she had ever truly trusted. The tragedies within her family deepened the shadows of her later years. Her daughters, already marked by her distance, faced struggles that no wealth could prevent, sorrows that no fortune could ease. Daisy, for all her brilliance, seemed unable to comfort them, her coldness forming a barrier even in times of grief. Was it inability or unwillingness? Did she believe that tenderness would betray the armor she had spent a lifetime constructing? Or was the distance too deeply ingrained, a habit born of her own mother's absence, repeated without mercy upon her children? The door between generations remained closed, the latch still catching softly, no less final for the years that had passed. And yet, for all the cruelty, for all the shadows, Daisy remained a figure society could not release. Her presence at gatherings was still noted, her name still carried weight. To encounter Daisy Fellows, even in her decline, was to brush against history itself, to glimpse the embodiment of an era when scandal was art and wit was sovereignty. She was less queen now than ghost, yet a ghost whose shadow filled every room she entered. One imagines her in solitude, seated once more before the clouded mirror, jewels glinting faintly in the lamplight, her face returning to her in fragments. Did she see in those fragments the girl who once walked marble halls alone, the widow who cast aside her veil, the muse clothed in shocking pink? Or did she see only the cruelty she had sharpened, the brilliance she had sustained, the loneliness she had never confessed? The mirror gave no answers, only blurred outlines, only the reminder that time spares no reflection. Still, Daisy's defiance did not waver. She continued to speak, to wound, to command, to remind the world that she had not disappeared. If her presence had grown spectral, it was a specter of power, not weakness. She lingered, not as relic, but as force, her unfinished smile as unsettling in age as it had been in youth. The years pressed forward, and society changed. The salons that had once defined her grew fewer, the chandeliers dimmed, the laughter thinned. Yet Daisy endured, her legend crystallized even as her world dissolved. She was the last echo of an age that no longer existed, and she carried that echo with merciless pride. The mirror clouded further, its surface mottled beyond repair, its silver backing retreating from time's corrosion. In its blurred depths, the outline of her figure dissolved into the rustle of silk, folded carefully away into cedar chests, garments that once startled, gowns that once commanded, fabrics that now whispered only memory. The rustle of silk, folded carefully into a cedar chest, carried with it the faint aroma of time, wood and fabric mingling, perfume long faded yet still clinging to the threads as though unwilling to surrender. Each gown laid away was a memory, each jewel a story, each accessory a whisper of nights when Daisy Fellows ruled salons with audacity and wit. Yet garments once dazzling under chandeliers become muted in the stillness of storage, and jewels that once commanded attention lie dark until touched by light again. So too did Daisy's legacy begin to settle, no longer a flame burning brightly in the present, but an ember, glowing faintly in recollection, waiting to be interpreted, weighed, judged. In fashion, her imprint remained undeniable. Elsa Schiaparelli's shocking pink would forever be tied to Daisy, whose presence gave the color, life, and legend. The extravagant jewels she wore, sapphires so large they seemed improbable, diamonds layered as though modesty had never existed, set a standard not of taste, but of audacity. She showed that elegance was not submission to convention, but defiance against it, that beauty could be sharpened into weaponry, that fashion itself could be scandal. Designers remembered her not only as a patron, but as a force who transformed their work into spectacle, who made garments dangerous by wearing them without apology. Even Chanel, who disdained excess, could not escape Daisy's shadow, for Daisy demonstrated that simplicity was not the only path to immortality. Extravagance, when wielded without fear, could carve just as deep a mark. But fashion was only part of her legacy. In society, Daisy left behind not only admiration but wounds, not only brilliance but scars. To those who encountered her, she remained unforgettable. They remembered her remarks, both cruel and dazzling, the way she could strip away pretension with a phrase and leave laughter trembling in the air like glass about to shatter. Yet they also remembered the sting, the humiliation, the way her eyes could render someone invisible in a moment of disdain. She was beauty laced with venom, elegance sharpened into cruelty, a figure who inspired both longing and fear. Her children, more than anyone, bore the double edge of this legacy. To them, Daisy was not simply the arbiter of salons, but the mother whose absence was felt even in her presence. They carried the weight of her coldness, the burden of her perfection, the ache of affection withheld. Some rebelled, some suffered, some sought escape in ways tragic or defiant. Their stories remind us that brilliance can cast shadows too deep for those standing nearest to escape. Daisy's name opened doors for them, but it also closed the softer spaces where love might have grown. The cedar chest of her gowns may hold beauty, but the chest of memory they carried held wounds more difficult to lay aside. And yet, history does not measure tenderness as it measures spectacle. In the eyes of the world, Daisy's cruelty became part of her myth, her venom inseparable from her power. She was both admired and reviled, a woman who never softened to meet expectation, who refused to be forgotten. This refusal itself became her enduring triumph. She forced memory to hold her, not as ideal, not as saint, but as paradox. Where others faded into anonymity, Daisy lingered, sharp as ever, her name repeated not in fondness but in fascination. One must ask, then, how should such a legacy be understood? Is it better to be remembered for cruelty than forgotten for kindness? Is brilliance worth the price of intimacy? Was Daisy a victim of her own loneliness or its master? These questions hover like dust motes in the light that falls upon the cedar chest, unresolved, unsettling, essential. The truth may be that she was both, victim and master, wounded and wounding, lonely and sovereign. In the halls of fashion history, she remains Muse, her image tied to the daring of Schiaparelli, the defiance of surrealism, the glamour of a world between wars. In the memory of Salons, she remains menace, her remarks still quoted in hushed admiration, her wit still envied, her cruelty still feared. And in the lineage of her family, she remains absence, her legacy both burden and inheritance. Few lives embody such contradiction, and fewer still are remembered for it. The cedar chest closes with a soft thud, the scent of aged silk sealed within, the rustle silenced. Outside, the air carries the faint echo of salons now vanished, of chandeliers extinguished, of laughter long dissolved. Daisy's gowns rest folded, her jewels lie dark, her words remain only in memory, yet her presence lingers not as warmth but as a chill, not as comfort but as command. She remains a figure whose beauty was inseparable from venom, whose elegance was inseparable from cruelty, whose legacy refuses to be simplified. And as the chest is locked, the silence it leaves behind is broken only by the faint extinguishing of a flame. The smoke curling upward from a candelabra, dimming the room, casting shadows where once light had glittered. The flame upon the candelabra bent, then guttered softly, its light shrinking to a thin thread before vanishing into smoke that curled upward and dissolved into the dimness. The room, once alive with reflection and chatter, was left in shadow, its brilliance reduced to memory. So too were the great salons of Paris, where chandeliers had glistened, where voices had sparred, where Daisy Fellows had once ruled with her unfinished smile and merciless wit. One by one, these salons faded, their hosts gone, their guests dispersed, their laughter silenced by time. The candelabra's extinguished flame was not merely the end of an evening, but the end of an age. Paris, after the war, no longer held the same rhythm. The aristocracy that once defined society was in retreat, its fortunes diminished, its rituals tired. New powers rose, political and cultural, and the salons that had once decided reputations and shaped fashion became relics of nostalgia. Younger generations sought freedom elsewhere, in smoky jazz clubs, in the avant-garde circles of writers and filmmakers, in cafes where ideas mattered more than lineage. The great gatherings where Daisy had once wielded her sharp tongue were thinning, their chandeliers swaying above emptiness, their echoes hollow. For Daisy, who had built her dominion upon these spaces, the fading of salons was both decline and vindication. Decline, for her empire diminished with them, leaving her without the stage upon which she had once commanded so effortlessly. Vindication, for she remained their emblem, their memory inseparable from her presence. To recall the brilliance of Parisian high society between the wars was to recall Daisy, to repeat her barbs, to describe her gowns, to invoke her legend. Even as the salons disappeared, she endured within their memory, the final sovereign of a world now gone. She appeared still at gatherings, though fewer in number, her figure more spectral than commanding, her jewels heavy, her remarks sharper for their rarity. Those who encountered her in these twilight years felt as though they had touched the last echo of an age, as though by speaking with Daisy they had conversed with history itself. They saw in her both defiance and fragility, both brilliance and shadow, both the cruelty of her words and the loneliness of her presence. And though she no longer defined the moment, she remained indispensable to its memory. The younger women who filled the new spaces, actresses, models, artists, were admired for their beauty and novelty, but none carried the same paradox Daisy embodied. They could dazzle, but they did not unsettle. They could charm, but they did not command. Daisy had not been beloved, but she had been feared, and fear carries its own form of reverence. Even in decline, she remained beyond imitation. Yet the extinguishing of salons revealed also the solitude behind her legend. Without the constant murmur of gatherings, without the endless repetition of her name, Daisy was left with the silence she had always carried. Alone in her rooms, surrounded by cedar chests of folded gowns, mirrors clouded with age, and jewels that glittered in boxes, she must have felt the absence more acutely. For what is a queen without a court, a wit without an audience, a scandal without whispers? The quiet that followed was heavy, filled with the weight of memory, filled with the ghosts of evenings that would never return. Still Daisy did not soften. She did not retreat into gentleness, nor did she seek to reinvent herself in the manner of the young. Instead, she remained who she had always been, sharp, dazzling, cruel, unforgettable. In this she clung not to relevance but to integrity, the integrity of her own paradox. If the salons had faded, she would not fade with them. She would linger, defiant, a reminder of what once had been, a figure whose brilliance could not be extinguished even by time. And yet, one wonders what she felt as she watched the candelabra flames diminish, as she entered rooms once vibrant, now silent, as she encountered faces once familiar, now absent. Did she feel herself victorious, the last sovereign standing among ruins? Or did she feel the hollowness of a throne without subjects, the futility of wit unspoken, the emptiness of beauty unadmired? Perhaps both, for Daisy's life had always been lived upon contradictions, her triumphs laced with tragedy, her brilliance bound to loneliness. The candelabra flame extinguished, the smoke dissolved, and in the darkness that followed, only the faint rustle of fabric remained, the sound of silk folded, the whisper of memory settling into silence. Daisy lingered in that silence, her figure both ghost and queen, her legend both menace and muse. And into that silence fell another sound, softer still, the hush of dust descending upon old letters, settling across words once urgent, now forgotten, as though time itself were closing the final pages of her story. The hush of dust descending upon old letters filled the air with a weight almost imperceptible, a stillness that marked not only neglect but finality. The ink upon those pages, once vivid with urgency, blurred beneath the powdery veil of time, their words unread, their voices silent. It was in such silence that Daisy Fellows met her end in 1962, her presence departing as quietly as dust settling on forgotten correspondence. She had spent a lifetime commanding attention, weaving scandal into power, turning wit into weaponry. Yet in death there was no spectacle, no sharp remark to linger in the air, only stillness, inevitable, complete. The news of her passing spread quickly, carried not with the shock of tragedy, but with the resonance of inevitability. Society, once quick to whisper her every remark, now whispered her absence. She had lived too boldly to vanish unnoticed, too cruelly to be remembered only with fondness, too brilliantly to be dismissed. The obituaries that followed spoke of her fortune, her fashion, her wit, her cruelties, her beauty, her menace. They painted her life in strokes both admiring and wary, capturing not resolution but paradox. For Daisy had never belonged entirely to admiration, nor entirely to disdain. She had belonged only to herself. Her funeral lacked the theater of her life. There were no chandeliers swaying above laughter, no shocking hues to startle the eye, no cruel remarks to unsettle the table. There was instead a gathering subdued, filled with those who had known her brilliance and her distance, those who carried both admiration and wound. Her daughters stood among them, each bearing her legacy in ways the world could not see, an inheritance not only of jewels and name, but of coldness, of expectation, of shadows cast too long. Their grief was complex, as grief often is when love and cruelty have been intertwined for a lifetime. Did they mourn the mother who had withheld affection, or the figure who had given them brilliance by blood, or both together in contradiction? Society remembered her as it always had, through stories. They retold her remarks, her affairs, her jewels, her dresses, her encounters with royalty and artists. They repeated the tale of shocking pink, the anecdotes of wit so merciless it provoked laughter through unease. They remembered the cruelty, yes, but they also remembered the presence, her ability to command a room, to unsettle complacency, to remain unforgettable. Even in death, she continued to inspire the same paradox she had lived: fascination and fear, admiration and resentment, allure and menace. And yet, for all the retelling, what remained most striking was the silence. The salons she once ruled were gone, their chandeliers extinguished, their mirrors clouded, their voices scattered. The friends and rivals who had once gathered around her were themselves fading into memory. The fashion she had inspired lived on, but her presence was no longer there to animate it. Dust settled not only upon her letters, but upon the world she had embodied, a world of scandal and elegance, of wit and cruelty, of privilege and peril. Her jewels were locked away, her gowns folded into cedar, her remarks surviving only in recollection. The woman who had once been unstoppable, who had built her dominion upon the refusal to be ignored, now lay in stillness, her voice silenced, her presence dissolved. And yet, in this silence, she lingered. For legends do not vanish. They shift into memory, into myth, into questions left unresolved. Daisy Fellows did not disappear. She became instead a shadow that history cannot entirely illuminate, a figure both admired and condemned, a woman who continues to unsettle even in recollection. One imagines her, then, as dust fell upon her letters, not erased, but transformed, her sharp words preserved, not in sound, but in memory, her unfinished smile still flickering faintly in imagination. She remains present in absence, her paradox enduring beyond her life. For the question she posed by her existence, what is the price of brilliance, of beauty sharpened into cruelty, of wit untempered by kindness, cannot be answered fully, only carried forward, unsettled. The hush of dust descended further, covering the table, the paper, the jewels not yet returned to their cases. The silence deepened, yet in that silence lingered her shadow, and as the room grew still, it seemed almost as though she remained there, poised, waiting, the echo of her voice unspoken, the glint of her eyes undimmed, the weight of her presence eternal. The silence held, broken only by the faint rustle of memory turning its last page. The silence deepened after her passing, stretching across salons now abandoned, across cedar chests, sealed with garments never again to rustle against the air, across letters yellowed and dusted into obscurity. It was a silence that did not erase Daisy Fellows, but transfigured her, shifting her from woman to myth, from presence to memory, from cruelty lived to cruelty remembered. In this silence she lingers still, not in the warmth of recollection, but in the chill of fascination, her unfinished smile haunting history like a reflection glimpsed in a clouded mirror. For what do we remember when we speak her name? Is it the beauty of an heiress draped in shocking pink, the muse who gave life to daring fabrics and extravagant jewels? Is it the cruelty of remarks so sharp they cut through laughter and left guests trembling in their chairs? Is it the tragedy of a mother who could not soften her gaze, who carried the wound of her own loss into the lives of her daughters? Or is it the paradox of a woman who embodied elegance and venom in equal measure, whose presence unsettled as much as it dazzled, whose legacy resists every attempt at simplification? History often seeks resolution, to tidy lives into lessons or parables, to paint figures as saints or villains. Daisy defies such tidiness. She was neither wholly admirable nor wholly condemnable, neither victim nor executioner alone, but both, intertwined inextricably. Her life was a tapestry woven with threads of brilliance and shadow, and to pull one strand is to find it bound tightly to another. She was muse and menace, beauty and cruelty, queen and exile, all at once, all unfinished. Perhaps this is why she lingers, why her memory endures. She cannot be reduced, and so she cannot be forgotten. In the annals of fashion, she survives as muse eternal. The color shocking pink, impossible to ignore, still carries her ghost in its audacity. The extravagance of jewels worn not for delicacy, but for dominance, recalls her defiance against moderation. Designers, knowingly or not, echo her when they dare to provoke, when they turn elegance into confrontation. In these spaces, Daisy is remembered not as a woman, but as an idea, the embodiment of fashion as power, of beauty as rebellion, of style as weapon. In the stories of society, she remains menace. Her remarks, carried down through recollection, still provoke laughter tinged with discomfort, admiration tempered by fear. To recall her is to recall not kindness, but sharpness, not warmth, but the thrill of danger. She is remembered less for affection than for effect, less for intimacy than for impact. And yet, in this menace lies her triumph, for she achieved what she always sought. She ensured she would not be forgotten, that her name would be spoken long after her voice had fallen silent. And in the private memories of her family, she remains absent. For all the brilliance she displayed to the world, she could not or would not give the tenderness her daughters needed. Their stories, some marked by sorrow, some by rebellion, testify to the shadows cast by her brilliance. In this lies the tragedy of her legacy, that what the world admired as power, those closest felt as distance. The silence of her childhood halls was carried forward into their lives, a silence more enduring than her jewels, more heavy than her gowns. What, then, is Daisy Fellows to us now as we drift into the quiet of reflection? Perhaps she is a reminder of the complexity of brilliance, of the cost of audacity, of the double edge of wit. She is a question posed to history without answer. Is it better to dazzle and wound, or to comfort and be forgotten? Is cruelty forgiven if it becomes art? Does brilliance absolve loneliness, or only deepen it? These questions hover unresolved, like dust suspended in a shaft of light, refusing to settle. And so her ghost remains, not in spectral form, but in memory's insistence. She is there in the shimmer of a gown too bold for convention, in the remark that silences a room, in the jewel that gleams beyond moderation. She is there in the unfinished smile glimpsed across history's ballroom, a smile that promises revelation but withholds it, leaving us to wonder, to speculate, to return again and again to the paradox she embodied. She is there in the silence after laughter fades, in the shadow upon the polished table, in the clouded mirror that refuses to give a clear image. As you listen now, perhaps in the stillness of night or the quiet of early morning, her presence drifts toward you. Not as comfort, not as warning, but as question. She lingers in the rustle of memory, in the hush of absence, in the unsettled air of history. And as you close your eyes, you may hear her still, the faint clink of a glass, the whisper of silk, the echo of a remark too sharp to forget. Daisy Fellows, Queen of Scandal, remains, not resolved but enduring, not softened but eternal. Her brilliance and her cruelty folded together like fabric laid away in cedar, still breathing faintly of perfume long vanished. And now the tale ends, not with finality but with silence, the silence that follows every life, the silence into which all laughter, all wit, all scandal dissolves. May it carry you gently into your own rest, as the memory of Daisy drifts like a shadow across history's floor, never gone, never fully present, always lingering, always unfinished.